The ectomorph, often coded as cerebral but nervous, was seen as better suited for behind-the-scenes analysis rather than visible management. And endomorphs, judged unfairly as softer or lacking discipline, struggled to be slotted into competitive corporate imagery. None of these stereotypes required HR manuals to spread. They operated informally, shaping meetings, interview impressions, and training brochures. Recruitment was only one space where this mindset showed up. Broader fields, like psychology, education, and even aspects of government service, borrowed from Sheldon's categories. In criminal justice and criminological circles, body-type theories were occasionally referenced as part of attempts to profile risk. The notion that muscular individuals were more prone to aggression, or that thin, wiry figures suggested nervous instability, echoed through mid-century criminology. While there is little evidence of centralized or official adoption in agencies like the FBI, Sheldon's claims bled into discussions already influenced by older traditions linking physique to criminality. It wasn't systematic policy, but certain practitioners and evaluators took such ideas seriously, adding weight to circular reasoning. Stereotypes reinforced Sheldon, and Sheldon lent those stereotypes the appearance of science. Popular culture magnified those patterns in its own way. Hollywood leaned heavily on somatotype tropes, turning psychological theory into stock character roles. The broad-shouldered hero embodied courage and decisiveness. The wiry thinker, awkward and eccentric, provided comic contrast or bookish expertise. The heavier figure, cast as warm but unserious, was confined to supporting roles or played for humor. Advertising and magazines did the same, presenting modern manhood in lean, athletic bodies suited for leadership. Even comic books borrowed these archetypes, styling heroes and sidekicks in line with Sheldon's categories. By the time audiences absorbed enough of these portrayals, the original source barely mattered. People acted as if the categories were common sense, never realizing how directly they mapped back to a debunked classification scheme. The workplace examples are telling in their subtlety. Oral histories from the 1950s and 1960s describe hiring managers who tallied personal fitness as part of judging an applicant's promise. Descriptions of ideal candidates often focused on physical cues, stature, weight, confidence in posture, rather than strictly on skill. Broad-shouldered applicants, for example, were thought to project managerial authority. Larger or heavier applicants were sometimes written off as less disciplined before their resumes were fully considered. Training advertisements amplified the same pattern, displaying slim, commanding men in tailored suits as the visual shorthand for modern business readiness. These choices weren't accidents. They were translations of somatotype assumptions into workplace visuals, showing how theories can insinuate themselves even without explicit endorsement. Even outside employment, the logic carried into schools, sports assessments, and personality evaluations. Students with wiry builds might be pushed toward academic tracks that aligned with the sensitive intellectual stereotype, while more muscular classmates were encouraged to lead teams or join activities coded as physically assertive. Heavier students faced the flip side of that bias, often underestimated in both classroom and extracurricular spaces. None of this was written into laws or policies, yet the repetition of stereotypes gave them teeth. The categories followed individuals through formative years, quietly influencing opportunities. What makes this persistence especially striking is how echoes of these ideas still appear in the present. Weight bias and height bias are well documented in modern hiring research. Taller men, on average, still receive higher salaries, while candidates perceived as overweight report higher rates of discrimination, regardless of qualifications. Recruiters, often without realizing it, link athletic builds with competence and leadership potential. This is not because anyone is citing William Sheldon in HR offices. It's because the mindsets he helped popularize were folded into cultural reflexes. Once stereotypes become habits, they continue long after their original justification is forgotten. Psychology offers an explanation in the halo effect, the tendency to assume that someone perceived as attractive, fit, or confident physically must also excel in intelligence, responsibility, or leadership. Employers making quick, instinctive judgments often default to these shortcuts. What Sheldon's theories did was give those unconscious leaps a pseudo-academic framework. Even now, when constitutional psychology has long been discredited, its mark lingers in the way snap estimates are made about who seems capable or reliable. No one references somatotypes explicitly, but the reflex acts as if they still apply, sliding beneath professional language about team fit and leadership qualities. Highlighting the absurdity can make the problem clearer. Imagine a job posting stating openly, preferred candidates, muscular mesomorphs exuding confidence, ideally with visible athleticism. The text is laughable precisely because overt discrimination is unacceptable, yet the bias it reflects operates beneath the surface. Hiring remains skewed toward bodies that look the part. What is treated as instinctive good judgment is often the unspoken inheritance of a pseudoscience once taught in lecture halls. Consequences ripple beyond unfair treatment of individuals. Once stereotypes guide decisions, even subtly, they reinforce inequalities. A mesomorphic frame, favored consciously or unconsciously in leadership positions, turns visibility and opportunity into a self-fulfilling loop. Heavier applicants or those outside the favored mold face repeated exclusion, and their absence from leadership roles is then cited as proof the stereotype was accurate. Structural bias masquerades as natural order. In practice, it is a cycle that rewards conformity to a body ideal at the cost of merit and diversity. By the latter half of the 20th century, the theory of somatotypes was collapsing scientifically, but the stereotypes it propagated were embedded in culture. Employers, teachers, and media creators didn't need to cite William Sheldon anymore. They simply acted on inherited assumptions. Popular culture kept replaying the mesomorphic hero, the ectomorphic intellectual, the endomorphic comic relief. These familiar roles outlived their original academic foundation. The silence surrounding their origins made them even harder to challenge, as they seemed like common cultural sense rather than artifacts of contested science. Even so, somatotype ideas have not disappeared entirely from technical practice. While constitutional psychology was thoroughly discredited as a theory of personality, a modified system called the Heath Carter method carried forward some of its language. In fitness science and physical anthropology, terms like endomorph, mesomorph, and ectomorph survived as shorthand for physique assessment, stripped of their psychological baggage. Trainers and researchers still use the words sparingly to describe body proportions in sport or growth studies, not to predict temperament. This survival explains why the language feels oddly familiar today, even when most people have never heard of Sheldon himself. The categories lived on in limited scientific niches, keeping the vocabulary alive in everyday speech. Ultimately, the endurance of somatotype thinking shows how easily pseudoscience mutates into culture. A failed theory can vanish academically yet persist as bias, stereotype, and casual categorization for generations. Sheldon's classifications never earned scientific legitimacy, but they played into existing prejudices deeply enough to become habits. Once ingrained, those habits shape interviews, social judgments, and cultural archetypes without reference to the original books that spawned them. Still, theories that embed themselves so pervasively don't last forever. The same institutions that once gave Sheldon access to archives eventually became focal points of ethical scandal and public outrage. As norms shifted and more people scrutinized the origins of these practices, the foundation of constitutional psychology began to unravel. And with growing resistance, in science, politics, and public opinion, the question arose: what finally caused Sheldon's edifice of body-type psychology to collapse? The collapse of a dangerous idea. Sheldon's framework did not vanish overnight. It unraveled piece by piece as different pressures converged. What once looked like a confident path-breaking theory came under attack from multiple directions. Public outrage over the misuse of student photographs, whistleblowers exposing flawed methods, shifting medical opinion that stripped away its legitimacy, and the backdrop of post-war politics that turned suspicion against any system of biological determinism. Together, these forces chipped away at his credibility until the entire structure collapsed. One of the earliest sparks came from students themselves. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, young women in particular began voicing discomfort over the use of their posture photographs. At the University of Washington, where Sheldon had obtained images of female students, protests pushed administrators into a corner. Some of those photographs were seized and destroyed after complaints mounted. The fact that nude images of women, taken under the guise of health checks, were being funneled into male-authored atlases provoked a level of scrutiny that colleges could no longer avoid. What had once been explained away as routine suddenly appeared exploitative, and the backlash opened the first visible breach in Sheldon's enterprise. The timing amplified the damage. In the wake of the Second World War, society had grown increasingly wary of deterministic systems that sorted people by body, race, or heredity. Eugenics, once widely taught, was disgraced by its association with authoritarian regimes and atrocities abroad. Sheldon insisted his system was psychology, not politics, but the parallels to eugenic thinking were never far from view. Classifying humans into fixed categories of biological worth invited comparisons many were unwilling to tolerate. The cultural climate after 1945 turned what might have seemed like a quirky classification scheme into something that smelled of older, dangerous ways of thinking. A science claiming that body shape revealed moral destiny felt out of step with a world newly sensitized to the risks of such determinism. Inside Sheldon's own circle came a second rupture. Barbara Hunneman Heath, who had worked alongside him, grew increasingly uneasy with his practices. She later disclosed that data had often been shaped to fit the theory, with inconsistent scores adjusted until they matched his expectations. The precision of his three-number somatotype scale, so central to the appearance of objectivity, was, according to Heath, less the result of strict measurement and more a matter of interpretive judgment, sometimes even manipulation. For critics of constitutional psychology, her testimony confirmed long-held suspicions. The tidy charts were not evidence of natural law, they were imposed order, made credible only by selectively including data that cooperated. This accusation of falsification cut directly against Sheldon's reputation for rigor. Once the aura of objectivity cracked, the scaffolding of his system looked unreliable. Sheldon's publishing efforts also contributed to his undoing. His Atlas of Men *, 1954, had already stirred unease by presenting page after page of nude male photographs, stripped of context and reduced to type specimens. But when he attempted to produce an Atlas of Women *, controversy rose sharply. Legal risks, public outcry, and ethical questions multiplied. Some images circulated in limited form, but the project never came close to full release. For critics, that failure suggested not only the limits of Sheldon's credibility, but also a cultural turning point. Institutions that once tolerated male archives hesitated when it came to female students. The potential scandal of distributing nude images of women, many of them taken under compulsory circumstances, became untenable. The collapse of this second atlas foreshadowed the broader collapse of his framework. Meanwhile, the very medical roots of his enterprise were drying up. By the 1960s and 1970s, medical opinion had shifted decisively away from posture examinations. New evidence showed that slouching did not directly predict long-term health outcomes, let alone moral character. Poor posture mapped to muscle tension, furniture design, or temporary habits, not destiny. Chiropractors could benefit from the slouch of their patients, universities could not. Once doctors dismissed posture as an unreliable index of health, the original justification for taking the photos looked flimsy. If posture photos no longer served a meaningful medical role, their continued existence in university archives raised even sharper questions about consent and privacy. Sheldon's appropriation of those photos only multiplied the unease. Public awareness magnified the damage further. As newspapers and magazines picked up the story, whispers about secret archives gave way to outrage. Alumni discovered that images from their youth still sat in university vaults. By the 1960s, some of those former students had become public leaders, judges, politicians, prominent academics. The idea that their nude photographs had been dragged into psychological atlases without consent turned embarrassment into anger. Administrators who had quietly filed the images away suddenly faced pressure from some of their most powerful graduates. Protecting institutional reputation often meant destroying the evidence entirely. Posture photographs disappeared into bonfires, shredders, and dumpsters. Some universities sealed collections permanently. Others, like Vassar, destroyed theirs after renewed scandal in the 1990s, when a New York Times Magazine article exposed their lingering presence. The 1995 exposé was a late aftershock that underlined how lasting the shame had become. Though constitutional psychology had long been discredited scientifically, the revelation that tens of thousands of nude student images still existed forced institutions into damage control once again. Many chose to obliterate entire archives rather than risk legal exposure or public scandal. The firestorms that followed illustrated how deeply the project had violated trust. Had the material been truly scientific in purpose, universities might have preserved it for historical record. That they chose destruction instead was itself an admission. The foundations were indefensible. Confronted with mounting failures on every front, public, political, scientific, and personal, Sheldon's reputation dissolved. The neat promise of linking physique to personality no longer carried weight in academic psychology, which was shifting toward cognitive science, behavioral studies, and models that accounted for culture and learning. His work no longer appeared as daring or innovative, but as a relic, an echo of older, reductive sciences that prized classification over understanding. Without institutional support, his theories reverted to the margins. The collapse of posture programs at universities marked both the end of his direct influence and the recognition of how far institutions had allowed pseudoscience to bleed into the lives of their students. The symbolic lesson endured even after the details faded. Sheldon's fall represented the failure of biological determinism paraded as psychology. Theories that reduced identity to physique proved brittle in the face of more nuanced research. What lingered was not his method, but the warning it carried. How easily prejudice can wear the guise of science, and how quickly authority can be misused when administrators forget the obligations of consent. His downfall became a cautionary tale in research ethics classes, a reminder that methodological neatness means little when built on coercion, bias, or selective evidence. By the mid-1970s, posture photography had been abandoned at American colleges, the archives largely destroyed or sealed from view. Sheldon himself slipped quietly into the footnotes of psychology, his major works treated more as curiosities than as sources of serious theory. Yet as his influence shrank, questions remained for the wider culture. If the man and his system had been so thoroughly discredited, why did traces of his categories still show up in stereotypes, in movies, and even in subtle hiring biases? Why did the culture continue to cling to archetypes that body type revealed destiny, long after the science had been erased? That persistence turns out to be the most haunting part of the story. Sheldon's system collapsed, but the assumptions it amplified proved harder to kill. And to understand why body stereotypes proved so sticky, we have to examine not the institutions that spread them, but the psychology that makes people still believe them. Why body stereotypes still stick? Even with Sheldon's framework discredited decades ago, the stereotypes it leaned on continue to surface in everyday life. The endurance of body-based assumptions is not about evidence. They have been tested and debunked many times over. The deeper issue lies in why people still instinctively connect body shape with character long after the science was discarded. Cultural repetition and cognitive shortcuts make the stereotypes feel natural, even when we know they are false. What survives today is not Sheldon's theory itself, but the same mental habits that kept it persuasive in the first place. Part of this persistence comes from how the brain processes information. Human cognition relies on shortcuts, and those shortcuts distort our judgments. Confirmation bias is one of the strongest. Once we form an expectation that muscular people are assertive, for instance, we're more likely to notice and remember behavior that fits it. If a broad-shouldered man speaks confidently, the moment sticks because it confirms the stereotype. If he hesitates, we overlook it because it doesn't fit. Over time, this uneven attention creates the illusion of accuracy, reinforcing connections that were never reliable to begin with. Research has documented this effect for decades. In fact, a 1961 study by Wells and Siegel found that people reliably associated body shapes with personality traits, showing how such stereotypes operate independently of Sheldon or his theories. The data proved the point. Remove the academic branding and the bias remains. The halo effect adds another layer. This bias makes us assume attractive or physically fit traits indicate positive inequalities like confidence or success. Seeing someone athletic often convinces us they are disciplined or capable before we have any supporting evidence. In professional settings, this can mean hiring managers unconsciously favor tall or lean applicants, treating physique as a proxy for leadership. On dating apps, users swipe right when they see toned bodies, under the assumption that health reflects good character. Few people would say explicitly that muscle equals competence, yet behavior often reveals exactly that assumption. These patterns show how perception, rather than science, drives decision-making. Alongside those biases comes the availability heuristic. The more often we see certain patterns represented in media, the more natural they feel. Popular films and television portray the strong-jawed, muscular character as the leader, the lanky one as eccentric or intellectual, and the heavier character as comic relief. Those portrayals repeat until they feel like real-world evidence. When meeting someone who happens to fit those outlines, people unconsciously treat the stereotypes as predictive. The abundance of cultural examples makes those biases easier to summon in memory, which tricks the brain into thinking they must be accurate. It's not logic, it's just familiarity dressed up as truth. These shortcuts matter because they slip into real situations that shape lives. In hiring, they surface as first impression bias. Managers often form judgments within seconds of meeting a candidate, influenced not by resume details but by posture, grooming, or size. The same biases that once made somatotypes feel scientific still influence these snap decisions: confirmation bias, halo effect, and availability heuristic. That doesn't mean companies adopt Sheldon's theories, but the underlying psychology remains embedded in how people evaluate others. One practical example: an interviewer might assume that an athletic candidate will handle pressure well, or that a heavier applicant lacks discipline, even though neither conclusion has any reliable basis. The result is discrimination disguised as intuition. Modern research continues to highlight the persistence of these impulses. Studies on hiring practices show managers forming impressions in the first few seconds of contact, often influenced by body size or appearance rather than verified skill. Dating platforms reveal the same effect. Users judge potential partners almost instantly, relying on physical cues as signals of personality. The behavior is consistent across contexts. Bodies are read as windows into identity, even when people know consciously that the assumption has no credibility. The repetition of these biases across workplaces and relationships keeps old categories alive under new forms. Cultural archetypes strengthen the cycle further. Popular media repeats familiar silhouettes so often that audiences internalize their meanings. A muscular lead signals confidence and control. The wiry and awkward figure suggests eccentric brilliance. The heavier sidekick conveys humor or indulgence. After decades of repetition, these roles feel natural, even inevitable. Viewers absorb the patterns passively, and the associations bleed into daily evaluations of real people. Even those who intellectually reject body stereotypes often find themselves influenced by images they have seen thousands of times. Exposure alone creates familiarity, and familiarity mimics validity. At a broader level, the survival of these stereotypes aligns with human history. For much of our past, judging people quickly by appearance may have provided a survival advantage. A stranger's physique seemed to offer clues about strength, vulnerability, or threat.